Welcome back to the Book Club. I'm Michael Knowles, and I am so pleased this month to be reading something that is not actually a book. It is Pascal's Pensées. I'm joined by Alexandra Hudson, the author of The Soul of Civility. You are looking very civilized. You sound very civilized. And we're discussing a book that all really smart, civilized people have read for a long time, that I had been meaning to read for 15 years. And I somehow did not get around to it until you made me read it.
You're welcome.
So yeah, thank you for being here. Why did you pick this book?
This is one of my favorite books. I was introduced to it in a class I took in college called Influential Christian Thinkers. And Pascal is not just influential in Christian history, he's relevant to society today. I think he's the thinker that we need in this current moment. He has a great story. He was this brilliant geometric mind. He invented a calculator at the age of 19. He invented the first omnibus, like public transit system in Paris. He was home educated. His father prevented him from learning math until he was 15. So he independently discovered the first 32 propositions of Euclidean geometry by the time he was before the age of 15, because his father prohibited him from math. He was
Didn't you? You didn't do that before?
That was not
15?
me. That was not me. Yeah, you must be mistaking me for someone else. And he was absolutely, a prodigy. And he had this radical conversion experience later in his life. He died an early death, so midway through his life, where he abandoned, he renounced all of his scientific pursuits, and he's like at the dawn of the Enlightenment. He's a generation after René Descartes, and he's rubbing shoulders in Parisian salon society with Molière and these luminaries at the cusp of the Enlightenment, and he rejects all of that. He's like the superstar of rationalism, and yet he realizes the futility of it, and he abandons all his scientific pursuits, locks himself in a room, a windowless room, and reflects on all things God for the rest of his life.
So that's where we enter here with the Pensées.
Exactly.
I say the Pensées is not actually a book because it's fragments, little note cards that he had left for a greater work that was supposed to be an apology of the Christian religion. So at the top of the show, I usually implore my guest to give a 1-minute summary of the book. In this case, that might include a little bit of biography about Pascal. But for someone who's never heard of this guy and has never heard of this book, what is it about?
So this is, as you mentioned, it's his defense of the Christian faith. He was a devout Christian. He died a Catholic, and he sets about at making an argument for why the misery of the human condition. He says, the human condition is defined by greatness and wretchedness. And we are constantly at cross purposes with ourselves. We are constantly pursuing distractions. Divertissement is the French word that he uses, because we are unable to sit with the wretchedness that is our humanity. And he says that, human happiness for Pascal can only be found through God, through Jesus Christ, through salvation. And so it's a really beautiful story of, him being at the pinnacle of the rational Enlightenment project, rejecting that and kind of dedicating his life, the remainder of his life, to not an anti-rationalism, but he realized the limits of rationalism. He realized the limits of technology, that he was kind of the first tech skeptic, where he realized that reason was not enough. One of my favorite lines from the Pensées is, "La cour de sa raison, la raison ne connaît pas." The heart has reasons that reason cannot understand. That reason alone, couldn't answer big questions. There was a different kind of knowledge, the heart knowledge, intuition and discernment, and faith that couldn't be explained by reason. And so that's his whole project, kind of attacking Descartes, attacking this Enlightenment project that people had put their faith in.
And probably the most famous idea in the Pensées, which just means thoughts, just sort of scattered thoughts of his, but all geared toward God and religion, is Pascal's wager, which we'll come to in a second, because that's probably the only thing that most people know about Pascal, this wager of why you should believe in God, why you should be religious. You mentioned that he died a Catholic, but he was kind of a weird Catholic.
Right.
He did ultimately say, I surrender some of my individual thoughts and maybe heterodox thoughts about religion. I surrender it to the Catholic Church. I believe what the Catholic Church believes. But Pascal was a member of a group at Port Royal called the Jansenists.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jansenists were kind of like Catholic Calvinists. They were not
Right,
quite,
right.
that's at least what they were accused of by the Jesuits, but that they de-emphasized free will.
Mm-hmm.
And they focused much more on man's utter wretchedness and on grace. They were a little skeptical of reason. And so even in Pascal's wager,
Mm-hmm.
he basically says, we can't know if God exists or not,
Mm-hmm.
but if you believe in God and act in accord with what God tells you to do, you might potentially gain everything.
Mm-hmm.
You can go to heaven. You can live in bliss in eternity.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're wrong, you lose nothing. You've lived a good, holy, virtuous life, and then you turn to warm food and take a dirt nap. However, if you choose not to believe in God
Mm-hmm.
and not to follow God's reason and his commands, and you're wrong, well, then you're going to be in the dark, fiery place for all of eternity.
Mm-hmm.
Who would want to take that bet?
Right. If you win, you win all. If you lose all, he says. And it's kind of interesting. Again, he's a brilliant geometric mind. And he, that's his first language is reason and rationality. And a lot of the arguments in this book, including the wager, appeal to the mind. It's a logical argument. It's in your interest, appealing to your reason to make a choice that is in your best interest. But so that kind of seems like a tension at first until you realize again that for Pascal, reason is just, it's not enough. It doesn't answer questions like it can tell you the what of something. It can't tell you the why. He was passionate about questions of origin, purpose, and destiny. He was passionate about questions of the condition of the human soul and the condition of our immortal soul. And I think that he was. I think that's why he's such a good voice in our current moment of hyper materialism and consumerism, that he elevates our minds to think of the transcendent, to think of the condition of our immortal soul, to actually look past kind of superficial definitions of happiness and to say, are you really happy? You have all the things that the world tells you should make you happy, but are you happy? When you're alone in your room, are you really happy? He says all of man's misery derives from his inability to sit quietly alone in a room.
Right. When there's silence and there's no more busyness and there's no more diversion.
Exactly.
Can you be with yourself? And this doesn't just mean, I don't know, having a Game Boy, or people don't have Game Boys anymore, but this doesn't.
When were you born?
I don't know. Yeah, this doesn't just mean, you play with the stickball down the street in Brooklyn. But I mean, he even talks about glory. And he says, we seek after glory. And he says that, that can be a misplaced love. But even here, he urges some caution. He says, the fact that men strive after glory is in a way a vindication of humanity. And because what it means is you care what other people think about you. That in a way, this is a kind of expression of man as a social creature. The fact, he says, that all of our dignity comes from thought. That's what distinguishes us from the lower beasts. We can think, we can reason. So the fact that we want honors, we want plaudits and glory, it means that we care what other people think about us.
Pascal says, man is a reed, the weakest in nature, but his dignity consists in thought. And he goes on to say that, a drop of vapor is enough to kill us in nature, but we will still be nobler than our slayer because we know that we are dying. And so he has this incredibly high view of humanity, that we have dignity, this concept of the imago Dei, that we share the image of the divine, that we are the noblest of the created world. And yet also, and he says, our wretchedness proves our greatness because we're able to be exceptionally wretched, to ourselves and to others. And there's this other great insight from the Pensées where he says, even young school children are taught that these are the things that you should care about, glory and pride and, having enough things in life. And he says the moment that one of those things goes amiss, people despair. And I think that, he wrote this 400 years ago, but I think he anticipates our modern malaise where we are so ill-equipped to grapple with any sort of suffering. The smallest thing goes amiss and we're like, oh my gosh, the life's over. We're just so, we're very ill-equipped, ill-prepared to grapple with the hardness of life. And he reminds us that, to look deeper, to not be satisfied with the superficial things in life, and to introspect. And if we look closely, he says, we'll find we're not as happy as we think, that we all secretly know we're unhappy. And if we were to sit alone quietly, we'd know that. Why else do we distract ourselves constantly? One of the technological innovations he worked on was probability theory. He wrote this really famous book on probability theory, and he felt guilty about that later in life because a lot of gamblers used it to increase their chances, their odds of winning at gambling. And so he reflected a lot on probability and gambling. And he says, look at the gambler. If you give a gambler their winnings without the game, they're unhappy. If you give them the game with no winnings, they're unhappy. You need both the game and the winnings for the divertissement, the diversion to be complete. He's just so right about the state of what it means to be human. And he's the thinker I think we need for our modern moment.
If you don't want to encourage gamblers, you shouldn't make your central thought a wager. I mean, he's a genius in everything, but he's got to think ahead. So let's get into the mysticism of it, because even though he's a philosopher, he says, no, hold on, forget about your reasonable proofs and forget about all this. Let's delve into the faith, the scripture on its own terms. And he tries to vindicate Christianity. And he says, no, Christ really is who he says he is.
Yeah.
Christianity really is the true religion. Judaism's wrong for interesting reasons. Islam is totally wrong, basically barely worth talking about. So where does that argument come from?
It really comes from his Night of Fire, it's called. And we can say more about in this context about why we're talking about why things are all numbered. So just really quickly, he died in this windowless room, and he was found after his death by his family. And his sister saw the Pensées, these little fragments, all hung all throughout his room. That's how he had them. He would write out all the Pensées on a big sheet of paper, cut it up, and then reorganize them according to themes. And so that's why there are these different renderings of the Pensées organized, loosely according to different themes and different orders according to the editor's purview. But his sister published them in one particular order shortly after his death, and they were remarkable, like a runaway bestseller for basically since. They're just this iconic, stronghold in French literature. But his Night of Fire, it was November 23rd, Monday, 1654, and we know about this because he wrote about it, and it was just a profoundly mystical experience where he encountered God. We don't actually know what happened. This is page 285, beyond what he shares about it, but he encountered God in a really real, powerful, personal, transformative way. And it was such a powerful experience that he realized, despite being one of the most genius scientists, mathematicians in human history, that was nothing. That was vanity. That was nothing compared to the importance of the sublime gift of the relationship with God that he had in this transformative way. And that's when he renounces his scientific pursuits, locks himself in his room. He barely saw anyone after this experience. And when he did see anyone, he wore a coat of nails that he would wear, and when he's in dialogue with someone in his small windowless room, he would jab himself with a nail. And if he found himself enjoying the pleasures of the world too much, diverting himself from love of God and thoughts only of God, this is a very extreme lifestyle that I don't condone. That it's not. I don't think a full view of what the richness and the good life is.
I think that if I refuse the third bowl of pasta at dinner, I feel that I'm a true ascetic. I'm living this deprived lifestyle. That's taking it to another level. But I love this line in the Penguin numbering. It's 286. It says, 2 kinds of men in every religion. Among the heathen, those who worship animals, and others who worship the one God of natural religion. You think to the kind of fabulous ancient Greeks who would make their sacrifices to various fake gods, versus Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who believe in one God. He says, among the Jews, those who are carnal and those who are spiritual, the Christians of the old law. Among the Christians, the gross ones, who are the Jews of the new law. The carnal Jews awaited a carnal Messiah. In other words, and you hear this in distinctions between the religions today. The notion that what the Jews were awaiting was just a king to come in and take over the Roman Empire or something like that. It says the carnal Jews awaited a carnal Messiah, and the gross Christians believe that the Messiah has dispensed them from loving God. True Jews and true Christians worship a Messiah who makes them love God. He goes so far as to say that true Jews and true Christians have the same religion. In a way, kind of progressive for the 17th century.
Yes, and Pascal has this insight, I'm loosely paraphrasing, but that we have a God-shaped vacuum in our heart, that we crave, we have eternity in our hearts, he says. And we have a longing for that. And we are too quick to fill that void that we have with the ephemeral, with the temporal, with material things. And that is ultimately going to cause not just disappointment, but prolonged pain and suffering, just like the vicious cycle time and time again. Like we buy something, we hope it'll fill the void. It might temporarily alleviate it or distract us from it, as he would say, but it doesn't ever fully do that. And so I think that's such an insightful insight into the human condition.
So we can only be happy and only fully ourselves if we know God. And we have to be Christian, he says. I mean, he says it is not possible to know God without knowing Christ, which part of me as a Christian instinctively assents to. Though I also think it's possible to know at least of the existence of God if you're a pagan or a Muslim or a Jew or a Hindu even of a certain sort. And so why Christ? I mean, this book was supposed to be, the book that this was supposed to be rather than just a collection of note cards, was an apology for the Christian religion. And for Descartes, who seems so reticent to claim that we can know all that much for certain, he says, no, the reason why you've got to be Christian, the reason why Christianity is so persuasive is the miracles. And he's writing at a time when many thinkers are trying to take the miracles out of the Bible.
Yes, exactly. I think that the insight that Pascal gets at is that we, as Calvin said, we're idol-making machines, that we create idols out of everything. We create a religion out of things to fill this void in our soul. And I think that's the insight that even a secular person could take from Pascal. Like he's dismantling in a really powerful way the human condition, the condition of man apart from God, greatness, wretchedness, vanity, diversion, despair, misery. And then, because he died before it was complete at the young age of 39, he didn't have the opportunity, scholars think, to really get into the case for Christianity. It's definitely a really well-developed argument for the misery of the human condition. He wants you to feel the discomfort of your current state. You think you're happy, you're not as happy as you think, and you know it secretly. It's why you can't just sit and be still and be silent. And I think that, again, is the message that I think is so powerful to our moment. There are things in our world today that we have made religion out of. I think politics is one of them, that people have made politics an idol. And they've elevated political tenets to levels of like religious orthodoxy, where if you're not believing the exact same things as I am, not making the exact same arguments than I am, not making the arguments with sufficient gusto, we might even agree, but because you don't want to talk about it all the time, that's a problem. You're a sellout, like all these litmus tests. That I think is what Pascal is anticipating, that we are filling the vacuum of our souls, this cavernous vacuum, with temporal things that will never truly fulfill us.
And his commentary on politics is really good. This comes from the fragments from other sources. Not, it's very hard to track where all of these come from.
Because the first edition didn't, like his sisters didn't compile everything, so there are other things that got in after. Exactly.
They found more little notes he wrote.
It's very confusing, yes.
But on politics,
what page is this?
This is in the Penguin. This is page 323.
Yeah.
Pensées 977. He weighs in on politics directly. And something I get from Pascal is ideologues who don't really have a grasp on what they're talking about, they tend to get very angry and they lose their temper. And Pascal doesn't. He can write about the wretchedness of much of our life in a dispassionate way as well. And he writes, the most unreasonable things in the world become the most reasonable because men are so unbalanced. What could be less reasonable than to choose a ruler of a state, the eldest son of a queen? In other words, hereditary monarchy. That's the least reasonable thing imaginable. And yet, he doesn't just inveigh against monarchy, as so many people of his age and the age to come would do. He says, we do not choose as captain of a ship the most highly born of those aboard. Such a law would be ridiculous and unjust. But because men are and always will be as they are, it becomes reasonable and just. For who else could be chosen? The most virtuous and able man? Well, that sets us straight away at everyone claiming to be the most virtuous and reasonable. Let us then attach this qualification to something incontrovertible. He is the king's eldest son. That is quite clear. There is no argument about it. He concludes, reason cannot do any better because civil war is the greatest of evils. So even as he's looking in this totally clear, uncompromising way at the problems of our politics, he says, well, you're not going to do any better. Here's why we've come to this conclusion.
We live in an imperfect world. Why are things imperfect? Because the human condition is imperfect. We are bound to suffer, and that's just a fact of life. And Pascal, for him, it's just, are we going to pursue the thing that will actually sustain us on the other side of eternity? Like, he's not promising that the moment you convert, suffering ends. But I mean, this is why he didn't fear death near the end of his life. He had an excruciating death, an undignified death. He was, dissected for scientific study after his death, just like totally disrespectful and ignoble. And yet, he apparently he was not allowed the sacraments when he asked for it, or the final
just
sacrament.
at the very last minute, I think he was able to get his viaticum.
Exactly. And yet he accepted it with grace. I mean, I think another thing to remember about Pascal, he lived a life of not just self-imposed suffering, with the whole vest of nails thing and like isolation.
Yeah.
But he was sick his entire life. People think maybe tuberculosis or cancer. We didn't have those diagnoses then, but he had incredible pain his entire life. And I think that gave him a certain kind of sense of the frailty of human life, the temporariness of life on earth, that he wanted what he did to matter. And because of the frailty of life, he only wanted to focus on the most important things, which, especially after his conversion, that was the life of the soul, focusing on spirituality.
And he looks at spirituality with that lens of having been a skeptic for so long. So even when he's saying, here's where the Muslims go wrong, here's where the Jews go wrong, here's where this, I love this line. This is Pensées 791. He says, the semi-Pelagians, that is, people who think that salvation can be wrought through work. The semi-Pelagians are wrong to assert as a general truth what is only a particular one. And the Calvinists who say your human efforts are to no avail and you're predestined to heaven or hell, before you ever have a thought in your mind, says the Calvinists, in asserting as a particular truth what is a general one, as I see it. There's even a little humility, as I see it. And I love this because it's not just some polemic or some invective, and here's why the Pelagians are wrong, or here's why the Calvinists are wrong, or here's why this group or that group is wrong. He says, no. Here's how they made the error. The people who think that your salvation is wrought through your works, they're wrong because they're saying that's a general truth, but it's a particular truth. You do cooperate. He's really influenced by St. Augustine, and he says, St. Augustine says, God made you without your participation, but he won't save you without your participation. That, in your particular life, you will cooperate with God's grace or you won't. But it's not a general truth in salvation history, all of which is from Christ. And then he says, and the Calvinists, who say that your works don't matter at all, they're asserting as a particular truth what is a general one. It might be generally true that God really, is the beginning and end of salvation. But he's asserting that as a particular truth, as if to say, you can't really do anything that will amount to much at all. And I thought, that's a capacious mind that can delve down into even the particular ways in which everyone is going a little bit wrong, and to have the humility to say, well, that's just as I see it.
I think he kind of, in a really savvy way, rhetorically savvy way, hangs a lampshade on all of these tensions in his work. Like, he believes in, and he does still believe in reason, but, but is making a whole argument about matters of the heart and, intuition and faith, which seem apparently anti-reason. And yet then he appeals to reason to make the wager, his most famous thing. And I love how you said he's a capacious mind. I think, this is attributed to Aristotle, but maybe it's apocryphal, that it's the mark of an intelligent, educated mind to be able to, hold competing things to be true at once. And I think that embodies that contradiction is at the heart of his view of the human condition, and even at the view of his work, that it's often both and not either or.
Even if the competing views are not both true, at least one
Right.
can hold them both in
Right.
one's mind at the same time.
Or hold that reasonable minds can disagree. I think that's another way in which Pascal can teach us today. We're very quick to assume the worst about people that we differ from. And Pascal is vicious, but he's respectful. And he I think he's a model to us about how to treat with decency people that you vehemently disagree with, and how disagreement can actually be a way of respecting people.
Because there's nothing that rings false in the way that he's arguing.
Right.
He has a great line in there. He says, too much eloquence is tedious.
That's right.
See, you don't want to just be giving Periclean orations
Yes.
every single day. It gets a little old.
Right.
And so some of the ways he's arguing, like when he argues against the atheists here by the end, this is in Pensées 882,
Mm-hmm.
he says, look, earlier he says, look, you maybe you don't believe in Christianity because you think that the apostles, almost all of whom went to their deaths to spread the gospel, you think they were what? Deceived? What's the evidence that they were deceived?
Right.
Or you think they're deceivers? You think they went to their deaths and they kept up the lie for all these years just for fun, and they somehow coordinated with each other because it was like a big joke? What are you talking about? That's crazy. And then for the atheists, he says, you deny the resurrection. You deny that Christ rose from the dead. That's too much for you. The guy turns water into wine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the guy raises but him rising from the dead, that's too much for you.
Right.
He says, well, hold on. If you're an atheist, you at least agree that you were born. So what's easier?
That's right.
What's easier, to create something out of nothing, or to revivify something that was already created? Surely it's much, much harder to create something out of nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So on what grounds could you possibly be an atheist?
Mm-hmm. And then he says, it's easier to believe that for something to be born because we've seen it. Again, relying on sight, relying on the senses, relying on rationalism.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I love it's so blunt, and to your point, it's kind of respectful, because he's saying, hey, hold on. Even though I'm arguably the greatest genius of modernity, which, by the way, is what one of the founder of the Columbia Great Books program, Jacques Barzun, said of him, writing at the age of 90 or something. He said, Pascal, even though he died at 39, he was young, and he was probably the great genius, and yet he comes out and he speaks in this blunt way.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like he could be sitting at a cigar lounge or something, talking to a truck driver. He says, hold on, this is what you think? It's so unpretentious. Even you come across a book, maybe it's just the French, but the Pensées of Blaise Pascal, you think it's going to be this really pretentious book. No.
Yeah.
You don't need to be a child prodigy, but you could be a child and actually understand a lot of what he says.
And I'm so grateful, to you for having me on the show to discuss this important book that, Pascal is kind of overlooked. I'm grateful to hear that the gentleman who ran the Columbia Great Books program, I forget what his name is,
Jacques Barzun,
that he recognized Pascal's genius, because he's kind of omitted from a lot of these. He's not really a part of the canon in the traditional way, but he should be. And I think he's not, because he talks about faith. Right? Because faith is anti-intellectual. That's his whole project, to show that no, they're not incompatible. They're different, and you need them both. And I think that's that he's remedying the excess of the Enlightenment, anticipating, the cult of reason that culminated in the French Revolution, where, and a really cruel irony in history, it breaks my heart. He was exhumed during the French Revolution, and his bones were shred all throughout, tossed about throughout Paris. So we don't actually know, there is no Pascal's burial place anymore. And that in the church, I think it's called Saint Etienne in Paris. It was turned into, one of the temples of reason during the French Revolution, which I think is just such a cruel irony of like what his project, set out to do. So I'm grateful to be here today to talk about this book that has been overlooked, I think, in recent history. And I hope this is a part of a Pascalian renaissance that I think we're due for.
When you talk about the tumult that convulsed Europe and continues to convulse the West today, one last line right here by the end that really got to me on the nature of self-love. This is in 978. He points to the Catholic sacrament of confession, much mocked and derided by his contemporaries and our contemporaries. He says, here's something that appalls me. The Catholic religion does not oblige us to reveal our sins indiscriminately to everyone. It allows us to remain hidden from all other men, with one single exception, the confessor, to whom it bids us reveal our innermost heart and show ourselves for what we are. There is only this one man in the world whom it orders us to disillusion, and it lays on him the obligation of inviolable secrecy, which means that he might as well not possess the knowledge of us that he has. The confessor can't go tell people what your sins are. Can anything milder and more charitable be imagined? And yet, such is man's corruption that he finds even this law harsh. And this is one of the main reasons why a large part of Europe has revolted against the church. The people then as now who would say this, this confession, this notion that you're going to tell a man your sins, this is preposterous, this is backward, this is abhorrent and oppressive. But what do we get in its place? Now, instead of going and confessing my sins to a confessor, whom we believe has the power to absolve us of our sins, for this little minor thing of saying, hey, God, I'm sorry I did bad stuff because I'm kind of a bad guy. Now we just confess all of our sins to our cell phone and TikTok.
No, I think you're absolutely right that, my friend is writing a book on this, that we are turning to ChatGPT for confession and for therapy and even for romantic relationships.
Yeah.
Why? And this is like so anticipated. There's Pascal, his fingerprints anticipating this entirely. Why are we doing that? It's because it's hard, it's vulnerable to confess to a human being, to a therapist, to be in relationship with someone who might reject you, and a computer will never reject you. And in the public sort of pseudo confession where people go on and cry on TikTok or whatever, there at least you get the glory. Right.
There at least you might get the likes.
The absolution.
Absolution.
You're okay. You get the public saying, "Oh, you recognize you've done wrong."
That's not that bad.
Exactly.
That's not that bad.
You're brave.
But the confessional is much like Pascal saying, just lock yourself in a room.
Right.
And just actually look at yourself.
Can
you handle that? Today as then? Probably not. But I think maybe the clearest bit of invective and anger you get from Pascal in here comes from people who just refuse to look for God. He says, if Christian charity did not demand that I have pity for these people, I would have nothing but contempt for those who just refuse. They just will not look for God. He says, what are these people even doing?
Yeah,
That's my paraphrase. He was more eloquent than I.
Yes. He said there are two kinds of people that one can call reasonable: those who serve God with all their heart because they know him, and those who seek him with all their heart because they do not know him. Those are the only two reasonable people. Again, that's interesting, bringing reason back into his argument for a thing of the faith, a thing that is often characterized as being contra reason. But no, they can be in harmony together, to your point about Pascal being not antithetical, but rejecting that church teaching about reason being.
Yeah, he kind of goes back and forth. That's why you can't call him. Whenever you try to pin him down, he slips away.
Exactly.
He's a sort of a Calvinist. No, he's not. He's not. He's a fideist. He's not. And he's certainly smarter than any of his interlocutors.
I think that's also a great way in which he teaches us now. We are a world of dichotomies, of dualities, of black and white, right or wrong, good or evil, and us versus them. And Pascal kind of transcends all of the sort of traditional culture war terrain, and he just talks about what it means to be human and what a meaningful life is, and how to get more of it. And I love, and again, like you said, you can't pin him down. He doesn't fit neatly into these tribal camps of it, like past or present, really. And I think that's why more people should read him.
They should. What are you doing because Lexi read the nice Pensées about the reasonable people, but he's got harsh words for you in his little meaner Pensées. If you are not seeking God, if you're just content with, or you think you're content with your diversions, you're not.
Right.
And it's likely not going to turn out very well. So seek God, and also read Pascal's Pensées. And also read Lexi's book.
Aw, thank you.
The Soul of Civility. Lexi, thank you so much for being
Thanks for having me, Michael. Great to be here.
And thank you. We will see you next time on the Book Club. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Book Club on PragerU. PragerU is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so we rely on donations from viewers like you to keep this content on the air. Please consider making a tax-deductible contribution today to help keep this content coming. Thank you very much.